effort on your part, so especially congratulations. And with that said, we'd like to invite the Prime Minister up to open up this, what is really going to be a very interesting debate.
You all hate when I use that. Okay, is everybody ready? Great. When we're talking about weapons of such evil, weapons that do such damage to innocent civilians, I believe that we have no choice but to deter their use in the most effective ways possible, and we believe that by the enforcement of red lines, that is ultimately the most effective and realistic way in which you can actually deter use of chemical weapons. So, let's start by talking about some modeling on this. We think that it's going to be quite clear about what we mean by this. A red line, if you use a chemical weapon on your civilians, or even if you're testing chemical weapons, we're going to say you're going to start with proportional strikes that are going to happen on a sliding scale. So maybe as a first violation, you're going to see things like limited strikes on like a limited military facility or things like that. And if they keep violating these kinds of things, you can escalate as the violations keep coming in. We're going to say that the people who should conduct and enforce these kinds of actions would be the United States or affiliated allies like NATO. So that is the model that we're going to go with today. So I want to start by talking about the principles involved, about why I think that it is absolutely justified to use military force in these kinds of circumstances. Clarification, sure, what's up?
So if a regime utilizes chemical weapons, they survive the limited strikes, and they win the conflict, are you going to allow that regime to remain in power?
Sure. We're going to say that if they use chemical weapons and then we give their strikes, if they don't use chemical weapons further than that, we're not going to get any more involved. And maybe case by case basis that would differ, but that's not the broad principle we're going to defend. So let's talk about the principles about the chemical weapons and why there's justified use here. So first and foremost, I think that the use of these kinds of things is an inherent evil on a humanitarian level that we absolutely should not tolerate on a global stage. Keep in mind that when you're talking about biological weapons, things that if you drop these usually civilian populated areas, they're uniquely likely to spread, uniquely likely to affect more vulnerable people in society and things like that, and civilians who shouldn't be having any place in getting involved in this conflict. And I think in a lot of ways that gets rid of the right that states would have to their sovereignty over those people. But additionally, I would also argue that the threat of spreading, the threat of contagion of these kinds of things is also a justification for those kinds of things. Because keep in mind, if you allow the keeping, for example, weaponized anthrax or things like that, or maybe even things like weaponized smallpox or any of these other kinds of things, these are incredibly dangerous to on a massive scale. These aren't simply things that are would result in limited isolated damage in a blast range or things like that. These are things that have potential for incredibly wide-ranging international repercussions. But additionally, these things are simply a violation of international norms, and I think that we have to make sure that we're actually doing things to enforce those kinds of things. So now that we've established these principled obligations, I'm going to talk about why I think that red lines are going to be an effective way, enforcing red lines are an effective way to actually stop leaders from using chemical weapons. So first and foremost, let's try to talk about what is actually going through these leaders' minds when they use chemical weapons on their own people. They're probably thinking, I need to do whatever I can to maintain my power, to maintain my autocratic rule over the people, and I need to suppress dissent. So I think that therefore, the greatest threat that they are going to perceive are going to be things that are going to be a threat to their rule. And I think that United States or affiliated military strikes are in a lot of ways deemed as a threat to their rule. Because I think that it's quite obvious that all of these regimes, whether they're talking about Assad or other regimes who are willing to use chemical weapons, at the end of the day, if the United States wanted to depose them, if they wanted to go far enough to do so, the United States has the capability to do so. So I think that this is very key, because I think that when you start by taking limited strikes, and when you show that if they keep trying to violate these norms, you're willing to keep escalating the strikes again and again to make sure you get your point across that this is simply unacceptable behavior, I think that you are going to get the point across to those leaders that if they keep doing what they are doing, the United States and other actors will not sit idly by, and they will take military actions, if possible, to lead to deposing these leaders if they keep violating these kinds of things again and again. I think this is something that is going to scare a lot of these leaders, because they are going to want to keep their power, and they're also going to be worried about possibly, moreover, even if they don't actively get deposed by these kinds of government, like a government like the United States, they'll keep having their ability to use a lot of these weapons, they'll keep having a lot of their abilities to suppress their people further, they'll keep having a lot of the infrastructure that exists in that country. The United States will be able to destroy a lot of that as well. So it's certainly going to also lead to more of a destabilization of the regime in place. So I think that these leaders are definitely not going to be all too happy with that. I think that's incredibly important because I think that that operates as leverage against these leaders to prevent them from using that. But secondarily, in addition to the more like soft politics point about how you can deter leaders' use, I also think that by these kinds of attacks, you can try to flat out take out the ability of a lot of these regimes to use chemical weapons. Keep in mind that the United States and a lot of these actors oftentimes operate with incredibly extensive intelligence that they've spent billions of dollars on, and they oftentimes have a pretty good idea of where a lot of these military facilities are, where a lot of these weapons are being deployed from, and what are strategies that could be used to ultimately stop their use and things like that. So I think that you can further focus attacks on these kinds of institutions. You can further attacks in that way that are ultimately going to take out the ability of them to actually use these weapons in the first place. So even if you don't deter the leaders from using their use, you can deter their ability to use them at all, which I think is still going to be a win, because at the end of the day, that means that you're going to have people on the ground that aren't going to have to worry about the fear of these kinds of chemical weapons. But before I move on to more of a comparative point of deterrence, about comparing this to diplomacy and international law, I'll take a POI from
Okay, so what's the principal difference between a drone strike or a landmine and these chemical weapons? Because these are things that the West uses all the time and still continues to reinforce with it, even though they violate international norms.
First of all, the motion says we're talking about this. That's what we're talking about. We're agnostic on other things. Second of all, I already gave reasons about the unique likelihood of this attacking civilian targets, the unique likelihoods of contagions going beyond simply merely a blast radius. I think that's more than sufficient to come up with something better. So let's start by talking about international law and a point of comparison, comparative efficacy here. I think that in the end of the day, we obviously already have international laws that are preventing the testing and use of chemical and biological weapons, because pretty much everyone agrees that these things are incredibly dangerous and we shouldn't be using them. Here's the problem: at the end of the day, the only ways in which you can actually deter use with international law is A, the inherent trust and honor of leaders, because there's not really any inherent enforcement mechanism to a lot of these things, or B, you can use military force in order to actually try to get your point across, which is what we're proposing. Here's the problem: I don't think that you can rely on simply diplomatic means to ultimately enforce things against autocratic dictators who are clearly willing to flout international law in the first place by killing their own civilians. But I also think that furthermore, if you want to even eventually arrive at a diplomatic conclusion, you need to make sure that there's an impetus for negotiations in the first place. You need to make sure that there is a reason why you would bring these people to the table in the first place. I think that reason is fear of further military escalation. I think that fear is further attacks against that regime. So I think that if you ultimately want to achieve a military, a diplomatic conclusion anyway, the best way to do that is to make sure that the people are forced to go to the table. And they can't just say, why would I negotiate? Why would I give something up? You're not going to do anything about this anyway, and I can just keep doing what I'm doing. At the end of the day, no matter what solution you have to do, you have to take a hard line. Otherwise, Assad and other actors will keep doing it again and again. We're very proud of it.
Doesn't understand why a child being gunned down on the street is more palatable than a child being killed by sarin gas at home. We don't understand why the arbitrary lines of military intervention ought to be drawn when chemical weapons are used and not earlier. We think in principle, if you are against dictators oppressing their people, then you should launch a full-scale military intervention using the might of the West as quickly as possible. The moment the government starts shooting into the crowd, the moment something like Tibet happens, that's when we need to intervene before it's too late, before they start using chemical weapons, because we will argue things are much worse in that world. Okay, rebuttal will be integrated. First thing I want to talk about, given that we've already established an opening opposition that we'd like to intervene much earlier the moment oppression is detected, the first question I have to ask is then, is a red line, a good deterrent against this sort of activity? Because the central thrust over here is that, oh, dictators will be frightened, they just won't do it. 4 levels of analysis here. The first is to say that the dictators we're often dealing with are megalomaniacal leaders with cults of personality who often think of themselves as demigods. We're talking about people like Bashar al-Assad, like Jean-Pierre Bemba, and to a large extent, a lot of sub-Saharan African leaders maintain their power base by having this cult of personality, and as a result, never think that they're going to be disposed. They often think that they have some kind of mandate of heaven, and therefore don't act in the rational ways you expect them to do. But even if they do, second level of response here, even if they are rational, then they don't care about integrating with the rest of the world, and are oftentimes overly optimistic about how well they can deal with Western powers, given the precedent that they have to believe that they can in the past. So given Iraq, given Afghanistan, it's very clear that small protracted insurgencies under like a dictatorial regime can oftentimes beleaguer American forces for decades, and it hasn't been shown to them that the Western might of the Western world can crush them in one fell swoop, and so they don't believe this will happen with them, just like it didn't happen with their fellow dictators. Third level of response then is we don't understand this whole thrust coming from them that they're going to be frightened and they're just not going to do it. We think these are the people that are least likely to be allowed to be bullied. We think the threat of coming down on them is what turns them on most to maintain the control they have over their state. It is very important for these leaders to have a strong front and to prove to their people, whether rightly or wrongly, that they are invincible. To maintain this perception, it's very important to respond to international bullying with more aggression, with things like strengthening up, doubling down, and saying we are not afraid of the West. If you enforce a red line on chemical weapons, probably the reverse will happen, just so that this leader can maintain the perception that they do not fear the West, that they are strong, so that they can strengthen rhetoric with their supporters on the ground. So we don't think that you get any impetus for negotiation at the point at which you pigeonhole leaders and force them to be aggressive so they can maintain their status of protector of the people against the West. You need to do a lot more work as to why the dictators that we've characterized are likely to come to your table when you bully them. And the comparative here is obviously what happened in Syria. So the moment Obama decided to bully Assad and say we're going to attack you, which he never did, it didn't matter because Assad quickly moved to allies in the East, Assad in China. He quickly doubled down and he didn't come to the table at all. We don't think he received anything from US on that. Have a seat. So you need to do a lot more work to prove why the characterization we have on our side is one that allows for negotiation, given that's the least in the least interest of those dictators. Second thing to consider then, how does this make things worse? Because here's the next bit of characterization. We want to ask you, when do dictators use chemical weapons? We say it's not often at the start of their power. We think it's oftentimes long after they've established a structural power base and therefore need to use chemical weapons to strengthen that power base and create a sense of fear. So dictators are much more likely to resort to conventional things like shooting to the crowd, like conventional warfare, and this is what you saw in Syria for the vast majority of the conflict. Chemical weapons only recently entered the arena and are used very sparingly and occasionally to create a sense of fear. So after sarin gas was deployed in 2012, there was a long period of time where all Assad did was circle Damascus with helicopters because that message was sent across. So have a seat. Recognize that chemical weapons are used very late in a dictator's regime, and at this point they presumably carved out a path of blood and established a very strong power base. So why is it terrible that you intervene in this moment? 5 reasons. The first is you think at this point they already have an incredibly strong power base and you're likely to see a protracted insurgency on your side of the house. So the West is going to come in, the war is going to be very long, you're going to see war crimes on both sides, and populations will probably lose faith in Western allies and move further towards supporting the dictator. Second thing, we think it forces dictators to double down and use chemical weapons more. Clear examples of dictators, the more beleaguered they get, for example like John Pierre Bemba, the smaller his party got, the more desperate he was to fight and the more likely he was to resort to the worst kinds of war crimes to instill the sense of fear he needed to maintain control of DRC. So you're likely to see a lot more chemical weapons on your side. And you cannot just argue, oh, things are as bad as they're going to get, because now you're seeing chemical warfare being deployed once every 5 years. On your side of the house, the scale will become much worse at the point at which dictators are forced to double down and gas their people a lot more, and American citizens think that's terrible. The third level of response then is when lives get worse for people on the ground, given the protracted insurgency we argue will happen on your side, there will be a swift turn against the West for 2 reasons, sub-levels here. The first is that war crimes are often committed on both sides in protracted insurgencies. Like we saw in Iraq with Baghdad Correction Facility, like we saw in Rwanda with the abuses of the Blue Helmet State, war crimes on both sides often cause people in the middle to demonize the West and to move away from them. It's very easy then for leaders and dictators to increase support for their faction by demonizing the West, by pointing out war crimes in a protracted insurgency. The next thing to consider, the second sub-level, is a protracted insurgency often means people at home lose faith in the war. I'll take a look.
Sure. Accepting your characterization of dictators as megalomaniacal rogue state leaders who want to be bullied, what makes you think they're going to negotiate on your side of the table?
So on us in the House, we're happy to concede that negotiation is very hard against the kind of characterization we offered you. That's why we think we should intervene as early as possible and depose them as early as possible before they get to the state where they start using chemical weapons. we're happy to push that bright line back. Recognize that protracted insurgency, which is likely to happen on your side of the house, will result in people back home in the States or in France losing faith in the war and voting for more nativist, isolationist politicians, as you saw, and you're going to see the West become increasingly complacent about going into places like this. Now, given the harms, let's talk about the principle. We don't understand why chemical weapons are principally worse than any of the other things we've talked about, and why you're happy for all these other things to go on for like 10, 20 years up to the point chemical weapons have. And even if you want to enforce it, the line we get from up is incredibly weak. They want gradual, targeted airstrikes. How much has that done in Syria to deter Bashar al-Assad? You think that you know where to target. We think that no matter how many air forces you bomb, that has done very little in deterring Assad, and it's also strengthened his power base. We think your line is very soft, and we don't understand why you would just launch missiles and not have a full-scale military intervention, and why you would not have such a military intervention earlier. The red line is arbitrary, we push it back.
I think that it is truly bizarre that responses to our advocacy of drone strikes in a sliding scale in proportion to the chemical weapon strikes are things such as insurgencies will break out when we invade them, which is not going to happen on our side of the house. In fact, that is the advocacy that opposition plans for directly. In fact, they plan for such an insurgency, or they plan for such a full-scale invasion without ever dealing with the fact that there might be reasons why at certain points you don't want to have a full-scale invasion when there is a civil war. Perhaps the fact that after you do this type of insurgency or this invasion, you need to then do full-scale state building, which has been shown by the United States to be incredibly ineffective in the past, and maybe is a reason why you don't want to intervene in every single instance. They also don't give you a line at which they would have this full-scale invasion. They don't explain to you at what point sovereignty is not a sufficient means, or sovereignty has fully been broken down. What I'm going to do is go over the principle and explain to you why we think that chemical weapons are a line at which we need to draw and are a clear point in the international scale where we can say sovereignty no longer exists, and that for that reason we think it is a fair point at which international intervention is justified. And then I'm going to do some line-by-line response of what we got out of OP, because I think it was woefully insufficient. So on the principle, recognize that the state as an actor is an inherently coercive body, and that the vast majority of citizens were forced into the state apparatus because of the place in which they were born. Given that that is the case, we think that the state can only have justice and only be a justified state if it exists to if it serves the basic bodily protection of all of its people. We think that in some instances the state is justified in using force against its people, certain things like criminal justice enforcement or breaking down insurgencies when those insurgencies against the state are unjust. These are incredibly difficult situations to figure out. But what do chemical weapons do? Because recognize that there is a wide variety of international law and international norms that govern against the use of chemical weapons. What this means is that when a state, when a government chooses to use chemical weapons in any capacity, this is a clear sign, regardless of the nature of the struggle, that the state itself has lost the right to the sovereignty, that the state has lost any sort of claim of serving the people, because it has gone beyond the traditional means of protecting its sovereignty. Given that this is the case, we think that this is a clear line at which you can draw, and a clear line at which you can take these sorts of strikes. This does not mean that the United States or other actors need to dive into this conflict full steam ahead, because we think that when you are doing these strikes, you need to keep the civilians in mind, those that you are trying to protect. And given that this full-scale invasion method of the United States has shown time and again to not cause any sort of gains for the public and only cause long-scale instability within states, we think that strikes against airfields, strikes against weapon silos, and other things like this, military bases, are much more likely to take down the infrastructure that allows for these state abuses to occur, and is much more likely to lead to people going to the table out of fear that in the future there will be some sort of full-scale invasion if things do not end, or that they will lose the apparatus that allows them to maintain their legitimacy, maintain their sovereignty, maintain their stranglehold over the people, because that is what, by their own recognition, these dictators care about, the ability to maintain power, the ability to maintain their cult of personality. If we take out their airfields, if we take out their ability to do these types of things, we think they lose that ability wholeheartedly. Also, I just want you to recognize that when when he gives examples of Syria and things like this, these are not parallel examples. The reason for this is that Obama did not choose to go in when a red line was passed. That is not our policy. We would certainly strike if a red line was passed. And you know what? President Trump did his first airstrike recently. I haven't heard of chemical weapons since, so maybe it really is working. Okay, before direct rebuttal, sure.
So on both sides, aggressive action against dictators might result in insurgency. The point is, on your side, you come in much later in the regime's power base and therefore likely to harm with even more protracted insurgency.
Okay, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm missing something. I don't know where this insurgency against the West is happening if we aren't putting boots on the ground. That is not our strategy. And I guess opening up will explain to you how this insurgency is going to come to pass. If they do that, good for them. Okay, going down the line by line. Firstly, they tell you that dictators think of themselves as gods and they develop cult of personalities. I would posit that these individuals are probably those that are most aware of the fact that they are not gods and that rather they put on this persona in order to give themselves a veneer of legitimacy, which means that these actors are probably just those that want to maintain power. And as my partner explained to you already, if you take out their ability to have this type of coercive apparatus, you take away the infrastructure of their oppression, they no longer can do these types of things. So we think that these are rather rational actors behind that cult of personality. But furthermore, even if that is not the case, we think it is preferable to take out the infrastructure for their oppression, because this means they cannot cause the harms that that cult of personality leads to. They say we are overly optimistic, or these people are often overly optimistic that they can deal with Western powers. Again, this is why strikes are probably preferable to an invasion, because it is true that invasions are succumb largely to the fact that these actors have a home field advantage. They recognize their state, they have an understanding of the geography, the culture, the military expertise that it takes to do these types of things, and they have people within the state itself that can act as insurgency. We are not subject to those same types of harms that opposition itself is openly willing to do when they say they're going to have a full-scale invasion. We think that this is ludicrous. They say that the threat leads to them cracking down more. Again, our method is the means by which you stop them from cracking down more. That is why you have a sliding scale. Perhaps they see this strike as an attempt at stopping them, and it's not fully sufficient, and they choose to go out further. If they choose to then take wider strikes, we think it is perfectly within the United States' capability to bomb the vast majority of their airfields. From what I understand, we have the largest military budget, and it is larger than the next 8 actors combined. I think that we are capable of taking out states, or taking out at least the apparatus that allows these states to use chemical weapons strikes. I don't think that the United States military capabilities in drone strikes is what is for question in this round. They say the threat, so I explained why that they're just not likely to be able to crack down more, even if they want to. They also haven't given you a reason why, given that these are rational actors, like under their assumption, maybe this is the case, but I don't think that these are entirely irrational actors, and given that they want to maintain their legitimacy, or not legitimacy, they want to maintain their power because that is what has given them the ability to do these types of things. It is unclear why, once they've lost this type of apparatus or the infrastructure that allows them to do this, why they wouldn't choose to come to the table otherwise, given that the alternative is probably a war in which they don't have the weapons to fight. Okay, finally, the last stuff about Assad. They say Assad didn't come to the table. I explained why this just isn't a parallel and this doesn't make sense. Yes, Assad didn't come to the table, but he was weary of the fact that the United States was willing to do this and went to Russia. Maybe not the ideal situation, but probably preferable to him doing nothing in the international scale and taking no steps in tailing back its chemical weapons. Yes, this wasn't entirely effective, but it was preferable to nothing, and we think if there had been a legitimate strike, or a strike itself, we think it's more likely that he would have come to the table with other actors. Recognize that the principle in this round is that we require that all people have their bodily safety protected. They do nothing except for starting a war that is going to lead to all the insurgency problems they themselves talk about. For these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
We thank you for giving that speech and invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the opposition's case.
The fundamental problem with the arbitrary distinction between horrific acts of war and subjugation of innocent civilians is that it corners Western powers into taking certain kinds of action necessarily when chemical weapons attack, and means that, number one, it makes it more difficult to act tough on other forms of abuse that are committed against civilians, which we think are just as harmful and just as perverse. And number two, it makes it more difficult to sometimes act soft and take diplomatic measures to get rid of chemical weapons in regimes where we think that's possible. That second point is dealing with their best case, where the kinds of demagogic dictators and authoritarian figures we're talking about are willing to reason. We think in most cases, at the point where they're willing to use chemical weapons on their people, and they're only censured at the point where they do that, they're still able to maintain an oppressive hold on their country in a way that maintains a quality of life that is unacceptable. We think that the arbitrary drawing of this red line prevents us from helping the people that team government cares about most. In my speech, then, I'm going to do a little bit of I'm going to summarize the opening half and talk about it essentially in terms of the main points of clash that we've heard. First, talking about the principle and why we don't think that the red line for inherent evil is chemical weapon use. Second, talking about the minds of these kinds of authoritarian leaders and why we think that they're more likely to double down and we are going to get more violence on this side of the House. And finally, about the lives of civilians and why they're not actually improved when you conduct tokenistic and meaningless strikes on military targets without actually targeting the problem, which is the fact that there's an oppressive dictator there. So first, in terms of inherent evil and the principle. The problem with the analysis on the principle from this side was that the reason that chemical weapons are such an inherent evil against humanity is that they have more of an ability to kill more innocent civilians. We tell you that that analysis is problematic at the principle level because we say at the point where a dictator or authoritarian figure, or particularly a government, has used any kinds of means to assault any number of civilian lives, that should be an absolute principle value, right? It is not a scale that at the point where the kinds of weapons they are using can damage more civilians, that suddenly makes that more of a pressing issue, right? At the point where a state is using any kind of weaponry, whether it be drone strikes, mines, or just an armed militia subjugating peaceful protests like you saw at the beginning of the Syrian civil conflict, we say that that absolute value of the sovereign power suppressing its civilians is a line that exists far before the use of chemical weapons. Because what it means to say that the red line we draw is at chemical weapon level is implicitly to also say that the 70,000 Syrian lives lost before that was not enough harm to be called a red line. That was not enough harm to innocent civilians and an abuse of power by the state for us to intervene or for us to try and help those people. We think that that's fundamentally perverse because the individuals who get harmed by other kinds of weaponry might be lower in number and they might have a less opportunity to spread to other civilians, but those people still had their absolute rights as members of that state, and we shouldn't ignore them or try and sideline them just because these weapons can cause more damage. That was our fundamental problem with that principle. We think they ignore the lives of people who aren't killed by chemical weapons, even though in a huge number of cases that is more perverse. So moving on then to talk about the minds of these leaders and why we think that they are going to crack down. So the first thing to talk about here is that Nish's analysis and characterization was that these kinds of strongman leaders often have a base of support in their countries. The fundamental point to note here in terms of how they're going to generate support and demonize the West further than they do is that these kinds of dictatorships don't claim responsibility for the chemical weapons abuses that occur in their countries, right? Like to this day, Assad is never going to admit that he used chemical weapons in this most recent instance against his own population. Rather, they try and foist that blame onto other groups. So what does that mean when the West automatically responds without any attempt at diplomacy, any attempt at communication by bombing like an airbase or bombing some kind of military, some kind of strategic target in the country? It means it empowers the rhetoric that the West is unfairly picking on this kind of nation, unfairly picking on a strongman leader just because he's trying to stand up for the values of his own country, and that they're trying to impose more imperial values onto that country, right? So what that means is that you get more of a zealous following behind a strongman leader from people that were already willing to follow him, because they think that he's standing up to a power that is trying to deliberately and target them and oppress their way of life and their culture. Before I move on,
what perception do these individuals have when the U.S. or any Western power goes in before they use these weapons and intervenes in these countries?
Yeah, cool. So I'll talk about that in the third point in terms of the lives of civilians. But we do think it's fundamentally different, and the way that the West can, intervene to combat the people that already support a dictator, the gist of the response is, at the point where these people are already strong supporters of the dictator, we think that the necessary course of action is to remove them. So I'll talk about that. In terms of why we think that leaders, in terms of the nature of them being extremely egotistical and acting as strong men means that they're going to double down, has to do specifically with the policy that the side is enacting, right? Because understand that they're not going to depose that leader or to censure that leader further if they've used chemical weapons and then never continue to use them in the future, right? So what that means is that the consequences to a dictator for using chemical weapons once, maybe twice, maybe thrice, are not extremely severe in terms of the consequences to the dictator themselves or to the regime, right? Like in terms of the Syrian, the most recent red-line like airstrike on the Syrian airbase, we think the fact that that airbase was being used like hours, days later, proves the fact that these people can instill terror while maintaining a strongman narrative, because this idea that like these kind of targeted and proportional strikes are enough to prevent that kind of behavior is ludicrous. So moving on then to the lives of civilians and why we think they're still fundamentally harmed. The first point to say here is that we don't think a full-scale invasion of these kinds of countries is going to be easy, obviously, but we say that it's actually worse when you allow leaders who are willing to use chemical weapons to then continue to oppress their people. What does this mean, and why is it particularly damaging? Because if a leader uses chemical weapons, is then attacked in the method of proportionate strike that these guys want to talk about, and then stops using chemical weapons but continues to oppress his people with more traditional forms of weaponry or like more subtle political forms of corruption, it is still seen as an improvement, right? Like in terms of international news, it is said, look at what a success this was for the West. We got this person to stop using chemical weapons. And it means that there's less will to intervene in terms of the lives of people who are still very much being damaged by more traditional means of warfare and of subjugation. And we think that like the fundamental problem here is that one of the biggest harms of chemical weapons and that they pose to people and civilians on the ground is the terror that they instill, right? The very idea that a gas attack somewhere in your city could spread through, could be odorless, colorless in your home or next door at the very second. And the reason that like their proportionate strikes and their idea that they're very happy with themselves after they hit an airbase is wrong is because quite often the case, like with Assad, is that after chemical weapons are used once, these dictators continue to instill terror by just flying helicopters around cities that they want to evacuate and threatening the use of chemical weapons. We think that side gets a tokenistic sense of achievement that doesn't get any real benefit for people on the ground. We're very proud to stand for those people's rights, regardless of how many of them are inhumane. Very proud.
We think the leader does reach the limit to the member of government to open up that debate.
If opening opposition really cared about civilians in Syria or in Iraq or in any other country where their leaders are accused or convicted of using chemical weapons against their own people, they wouldn't advocate a full-scale invasion, which historically has only led to the abject suffering and deaths of millions of people. Opening government already told you that the corollary and the analogy is Iraq, right? Because we use the pretext of Saddam Hussein having chemical weapons as the pretext for our invasion of that country. Even though he was a strongman, even though he was dictatorial, we think the people of Iraq would be far better off had he still been in power, but simply with his chemical weapons capabilities removed, which in fact we did prior to the point where we invaded him, because he didn't have chemical weapons at that point. I'm going to do 5 things in this speech. First, I'm going to give you a history lesson on red lines. Second, I'm going to respond to the arguments of the opening opposition, both speeches. Then I'm going to bring you a 2-part extension. First, I'm going to talk to you about the importance for effective deterrence and clear red lines, extending the analysis from opening government. Second, I'm going to bring you new positive matter. I'm going to talk about just war. I'm going to talk about when it is acceptable to violate sovereignty. And I'm going to talk about the responsibility to protect, especially the most vulnerable populations. But first, history. Obama warned against Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons in August 2012. Then he warned him again in April 2013. And in August 2013, Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons in an attack on Damascus that killed 1,400 people. UN weapons inspectors then confirmed 1 month later in a report that the use of chemical weapons actually happened. What happened in the aftermath? Well, the UK voted not to act, and Obama, lacking its best ally in the UK, decided, I'll leave it to Congress. Congress then votes not to intervene. We think in that case, Obama shouldn't have been a coward and should have acted. We think Trump was far braver and far more reasonable. Opposition's material. First, they say this characterization of dictators as megalomaniacal, they're rogue states, they won't be bullied. If that's the case, why would they ever come to the negotiation table, right? They haven't given you substantial warrants for why these people are likely to come, seeing as how, in very many cases, they're completely independent from the international community. Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, what do they have in common? They're heads of petrostates, which means they don't depend on foreign exchange in order to prop up their regimes. All they have to do is sell oil. They don't need the international community. They don't come to the table. That's why they don't negotiate in the status quo new material. Second thing, they say chemical weapons are used because these people are strong. That's simply not the case, right? People use chemical weapons against their own civilians when they're in a position of vulnerability. No happy, prosperous, popular leader says, you know what I'm going to do today with my 80% approval rating? I'm just going to use chemical weapons against my people. We think instead that people use these when they're desperate, which means if you're saying you should launch a full-scale military intervention, on their side you're doing it while these leaders are still popular, right? You're doing it before they've used the chemical weapons, before they've exhausted that public support. We think that that's unconscionable. Deputy Leader of Opposition tries a different tactic. It's like, well, conventional arms are different. Conventional arms should be treated the same way. Here's the difference. Conventional arms don't pose a threat to the international community because they're not movable and portable across borders, whereas biological agents are. The international community has an actual self-defense rationale for intervening because something like antibiotic-resistant bacteria or super smallpox poses a direct threat to those countries because it can easily be taken by a terrorist across a border into a country where it attacks them. Finally, they say there's no consequences to deposing this dictator. Just look at Iraq, like, seriously. Okay.
For years preceding the chemical warfare, you do nothing, and after the chemical warfare, when your target airstrikes, then you refuse to militarily intervene. How then do you meaningfully reduce suffering of people in that state?
So, regrettably, sometimes intervention does more harm than good, and in some situations, there's no way to stop harm. I mean, that's just the way that the world works. We don't have the power to relieve the suffering of all the people, nor the responsibility. First point of extension, red line and deterrent. We say that these weapons are dangerous because they're deadly and indiscriminate. They're indiscriminate because while drone strikes hit a target and landmines are stationary, chemical and biological weapons are both communicable and highly portable. Moreover, we say they pose a risk to the world because they're easily taken across borders. That's new material. It shows that they're a clear threat to the actual nations that are doing the intervention. Moreover, we say there's a danger of the development and possession of these weapons because the development of a biological weapon by scientists, a scientist accidentally takes out the antibiotic-resistant bacteria or super smallpox out of the lab, infects people, that becomes a global epidemic because people travel on airplanes, millions and millions of people die. We think that because you can't secure these things, because in these countries where these dictators have them, they're very often unstable. Point to Syria, point to Iraq, or point to like the former Soviet states like Chechnya and all those states up there where these weapons are now unsecured. We think that you shouldn't be developing in the first place. Why then do you have to have a clear deterrent? Because that actually deters people from developing them in the first place. Because if you know that you're never going to get to use them, why would you spend tens of millions of dollars developing something you can never use? So we strike those high-value targets. We take away the money from those dictators to fund social services, which inevitably reduces their popularity if they want to continue putting money into these ill-advised ventures. This is a clear and predictable signal to others that this behavior is unacceptable to the international community. But why is it unacceptable to the international community? This is pure extension. First, we say that these things are illegal due to international agreements and that their use and possession and development is considered a crime against humanity. Point to the Geneva Agreement, point to all of the prohibitions against the development and use of chemical weapons. We say that at the point where someone has developed and used these weapons, they've forfeited sovereignty, and the international community, under the doctrine known as responsibility to protect, has an affirmative duty to intervene in these cases. Now, why can't we intervene in cases like Syria? Because Russia has a vote on the UN Security Council, and the current structure of the responsibility to protect mechanically shows that the UN Security Council has to be the one to initiate this action, which means we're never going to get that intervention if we wait for a conventional chance. But the principle that undergirds the responsibility still applies, which is the international community has an affirmative duty to protect people when their leaders are damaging them, which means sometimes you have to act unilaterally. When the international community has shirked their duties, we think that we're well within reason when Trump launches these Tomahawk missiles to bomb the Syrian airfields and intelligence stations. We say these countries, because they're not reliant on the international community like Iraq and Syria, they're petrostates, will never come to the negotiating table, which means you have to act. Why then is our action just? 3 reasons.
First, because these weapons are portable and dangerous to the international community, there is a doctrine of self-defense. You should be able to stop the people from using and developing these weapons in the first place. Second, we say that this is a proportional strike because we're not targeting civilians, we're simply targeting high-value military targets and removing the capabilities of this thing to be used in the future. Moreover, we say this intervention is designed to save lives because fundamentally the world is a better place when we don't have chemical weapons. We think the international community has a responsibility to protect vulnerable populations, that sovereignty is not absolute, and that we can't intervene when we shouldn't do the ill-advised interventions proposed by the opposition. That's why we propose.
Let's hear for that speech now and invite the member of the opposition to open up the opposition next time.
Human beings are governed by fear. It is our most primal motivation, which drives us to seek shelter, to create communities, and to react against people who threaten us. We tell you that there are groups in this world today, groups that have been ignored in this debate, that thrive on that fear and use it to build their base of power. We're talking not just about state governments and people like Assad. We're talking about groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda that thrive upon the fear and terror that things like biological and chemical weapons spread. What we're going to tell you in closing opposition, differentiating from opening opposition, is that what we're most concerned about in this debate is the incentives that this policy provides for non-state actors to seek and acquire after chemical and biological weapons in order to draw the West into conflicts. We think that's what's going to win this debate. Before I do that, some commentary on the rest of the round that's happened so far. Recognize that opposition can win in two scenarios. First, if you buy the extension that we give you, but additionally, we tell you we can win if we point out that a situation after the involvement of Western intervention on chemical weapons gets worse. And I think Syria is the prime example of that, because government has still given us no credible roadmap to how intervening on chemical weapons is ever going to better the lives of these people. Here's what I think is opening government's cardinal sin in this debate. In response to the point of clarification that I asked, they tell us we're going to use a sliding scale, right? And that if you use chemical weapons only once, then you're probably not going to be subject to regime change. This means that they're not principally fulfilling their burden, because if you can survive just the first response, which is very small and proportional, then you're just fine. They're not enforcing a red line against chemical and biological attacks. They're giving 1 or 2 free passes on chemical or biological attacks to a regime that can then survive and grow stronger for it. We tell you that Assad is strengthened when he survives an attack on his chemical weapons facilities and continues to remain in power. That's why the government is going to lose this debate, because they never guarantee regime change. And if you use chemical weapons once or twice and survive the directed tomahawk strikes, you are stronger as a dictator as a result of it. We don't think that's why they can win this debate because of that. All right. Let's talk about state versus non-state actors. Why we think that non-state actors are the most important in this debate. Recognize that states have to engage with other states. This is directly in conflict with the analysis that was given to us by the member of government. They tell us that petrostates can just exist on their own with no one. This is false. People have to want to buy their oil, right? States want recognition, they want economic investment, and they want global power. Bashar al-Assad might be a megalomaniac that doesn't care what the West thinks of him, but the people in the civil service of the Syrian bureaucracy, the people that make dictatorships function besides just the dictator, do have investment in the success of that state and in its place on the global stage. This is why we think that traditional intervention is far more likely to succeed against state actors, because they have an incentive to build themselves back up into a successful state so they can function on the global stage and ensure that if they are a petrostate, people want to buy their oil. This is why even North Korea has to engage with China, because regardless if they're a rogue state, they still need someone to buy their products and ensure that they're recognized on the international stage. Not at this time. But second, let's talk about non-state actors. Why they're the most dangerous. Because non-state actors want none of that. They only want chaos, because that's what feeds them, right? They often create the state action that we're looking for, right? Many of the cases, such as Syria, wherein they begin cracking down on their populations, are framed as resistance to non-state actors and terrorist groups that threaten to destabilize the regime. So we think that non-state actors uniquely have the ability to destabilize state actors and to force them to take measures that would encourage full-scale intervention. That's why we think they're the most important group, because uniquely they can cause state actors to do things they wouldn't do normally. Closing.
Do you really think that ISIS has the capability to develop super smallpox or antibiotic-resistant bacteria?
No, not now, and that's a good thing. But once you increase the demand that these weapons have and the power that they have to completely guarantee Western intervention, they have an incentive to seek after and acquire those weapons. Let's look at the incentives that are now created for non-state actors, since that POI transition does so beautifully. We tell you that Western intervention in conflict is often the best thing that can happen for a terrorist group like ISIS. It gives them tremendous recruitment opportunities. It gives them PR and press on a global stage. But realistically, it also gives them the chance to take the fight to the enemy that they've always wanted to. Not every member of ISIS can go abroad and travel and commit a lone wolf attack in the United States. But if the United States comes to where ISIS is, then all of ISIS can gear up to fight. And that's what they want, because they're so ideologically committed to this destruction. This means that they uniquely destabilize the state, right? Look to Iraq and Syria and ISIS's actions. Once they were able to draw the United States in, they were actually able to destabilize Syria even further, creating more collateral damage and furthering their goals. Additionally, we tell you this gains them reputation, power, and fear on a global stage. If you can be the first terror group to successfully deploy chemical weapons or a biological weapon, you are suddenly leagues ahead of everyone else. All the recruits are going to want to come to you. All of the people who hate the West are going to want to come to you because you have proven that you can take the fight to them in a way that they fear the most, the thing that strikes the most terror into their hearts. And in a state like Syria, where these chemical weapons have already been developed and the state is already destabilized, we tell you groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have a unique capacity to acquire these chemical weapons. Because while they don't have the expertise to produce them, when there's a lot of them already floating around and these states are already destabilized, once you create the incentive to deploy these weapons, because it can draw the United States or other Western powers into that conflict, they have an incentive to seek after them. Sure.
On your side of the house, there's no incentive for a rogue state to scale down their stockpiles of chemical weapons. So why are non-state actors less likely to get these weapons on your side of the house?
Because they do, because once you're ISIS, the calculus is this, right? You can spend a lot of time and expense going after chemical weapons, or you can do traditional attacks that have been working pretty well to draw the West into conflict. But once you know that the best thing you can do to bring in the West to the people that you hate is to deploy a chemical or biological weapon, that's where they're going to focus all of their efforts, because that provides functionally the most return on their investment. This is why the United States and all other state actors and non-state actors poured a ton of money into nuclear weapons, because it was the trump card. It was the best thing that they could do to ensure their power and ensure their status. Additionally, a successful chemical attack can even allow a group like ISIS to frame the government and say that it was their fault and feed even more into the destabilization of their regions. This means that ultimately the best thing that, for example, Boko Haram could do if they want to take the fight to the United States and they want to strike back against the United States is to acquire a chemical weapon and set it off in Lagos, because that would guarantee Western intervention that would likely destabilize the state even further, creating the power vacuums from which these groups thrive. We think that non-state actors are the most important actors in this debate because they don't subscribe to traditional boundaries of state interaction, and because they don't have the incentive to go after these chemical and biological weapons now, but they certainly will when you make them so taboo that their mere usage can guarantee intervention. But even if you don't buy any of that, I think we still can't vote for government bent at the point in which they don't guarantee regime change, and Assad can use 1 or 2 chemical weapons, survive the Tomahawk strikes, and grow stronger for it. Incredibly proud to vote this.
The difference between conventional warfare and chemical weapons or biological weapons is that there is no distinction in the usage of these weapons. That is to say, when deploying these weapons, admit that conventional warfare does pose a harm to individuals, we tell you that it's more like it's less proportional when you use these chemical weapons, right? We think that we can't act in all states, right? And when they tell us that we must intervene in all of these instances before it happens, we think that this leads to like the reckless action that we've seen historically. They want us to have negotiations, but they haven't told us how they're going to do this. Furthermore, what did we get from closing? They try to tell us, well, this is like giving free passes, so we're not actually saving lives. I think they don't actually give opening government the right amount of credit, right? Because we tell you that opposition along the bench doesn't save any lives. But secondly, we tell you on the sliding scale that opening government gives us is that we are able to actually save lives if it is so that they come back harder, we're going to like attack in a proportional way. We think that proportional way falls into what Sterling tells you on why it is justified the West take this action, right? He tells you three things that were that go unaddressed in the last speech, right? He tells you this is just because on a self-defense level, right, that these chemical and biological weapons are trans-boundary, right? That's to say that they're posing a risk not just to those in Syria or in these countries, but to the international community, right? They needed to just respond to why this isn't an act of defense. But secondly, we tell you this is proportional, right? Therefore just. But third, even if you don't buy that, we tell you that the intent enough to save lives and to prevent this conflict from escalating means that it is just. We tell you that there's an affirmative duty to act, even if that means unilaterally. They didn't address that. We think that they need to come up here and clear that out. Second thing that closing opposition tries to tell us is that these petrostates need to be in the international community, and therefore we can solve this problem in other ways. Two responses. First, we think that this is in tension with the opening opposition. When the opening opposition says that these dictators don't care about being a part of the international community. But secondly, we tell you that the methods in which they're trying to solve these problems, like embargoes, don't work, right? Because these states just find a way around it. They needed to give us a reason, a way in which you get that negotiation, in which you get the saving of lives. We don't think that they have given us that at all. But what does this mean for future problems, right? Because we think that even if they're going to focus on like deterrence, that they don't get it on their side. We think that we actually get the prevention of actual future conflicts, meaning that the impact, even if it means that in the short term, in one instance, our impact is large. We think that means that in the future we don't have to use it again. Before I go on, yeah.
So under Gov's world, Assad is still in power because he can survive the proportional responses to chemical strikes. Why is that worth creating an arms race amongst terror groups for the next deadly weapon?
Okay, so you ignore Sterling's analysis when he says that when dictators use these weapons, that doesn't mean that they're strong anymore, right? Cutting into opening opposition's material, right? But furthermore, that means that these proportional strikes are more likely to work because he doesn't have the strong base anymore, right? What does this mean for future problems? We think that this acts as a deterrence for future problems, as OG tells you. But Sterling showed you how we can have a meaningful deterrence. That is to say that we don't just stop the usage and testing, but the possession and the development itself. Because we think the possession and the development pose a threat, right? In its own, right? We tell you that that threat is like just on the testing itself, like on leakage and like casualties in that aspect, right? This goes unaddressed in the last speech, right? We think they need to engage with us. But what do we hear from opposition, right? They tell us from opening opposition that there's hatred towards the West for its interventions like this, right? But that we should act before. Recognize the tension here, right? Because Sterling points to you the proposal that they're enacting actually led to the hatred towards the West. We tell you that you get it less on our side, right? You avoid things like Iraq. We tell you that on their side the image gets worse, and you're you're likely to fail in their instance because you're acting with a dictator strong, we act when he's weak. What did we hear from closing opposition? They tell us that this is an incentive for non-state actors. Three responses. First, we say that ISIS doesn't have the capabilities to develop these weapons, but then they try to tell us, well, they can just get them from Syria. If that's the case, then we can trace those, right? It's easy to determine if ISIS has those weapons and where they got it from. We think that we can stop it there. Then lastly, we tell you that what ISIS actually wants is to have boots on the ground. That is to say, on their side, they're giving ISIS exactly what they want. That is the military actually being there. We tell you that this is simply airstrikes combating ISIS in a way that doesn't feed into their strength, right? What did we show you on closing government? We showed you that in terms of current problems, that there's an affirmative duty to act, because this is not only like a crime against humanity for those in those regions, but also means that those threats actually are transboundary and actually pose a threat to your own citizens. Secondly, we told you that future problems can't just be deterred in their usage, but in its possession and development. We provide meaningful deterrence on those grounds. For those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you so much to the speaker for that speech, and now we'd like to call upon the opposition whip to present the opposition side of the case, and indeed, that's all.
It's interesting that we get accused of reckless action historically, where you draw a bright line stance that at any circumstance where one action happens, you are going to intervene in a conflict, and you are going to start launching airstrikes, continuing to the absolute destruction of whatever regime or non-state actor you get. On opposition, what we give you is a belief that flexibility in the implementation of policies allows for you to actually facilitate a safer world, a world where you have less conflict overall, and a world where inevitably you do not escalate chemical weapons into the catalysts of destruction. They tell you on opening government that chemical weapons are evil. We would say that war is evil. When you destroy people and displace people, that's evil. And at the point at which they create more of that war and more of that destruction by creating more conflict around the world and encouraging the West to engage with those conflicts, we say that we win this debate. We're going to have 3 questions to clarify. First, we're going to talk about this uniqueness of chemical weapons and whether or not it exists. Secondly, we're going to talk about state versus non-state actors. And then finally, we're going to talk about the comparative in this debate. First, on chemical weapons and why they're not unique. We think it's very bizarre that the first words out of the Prime Minister's mouth is that this is an inherently evil act, yet we're going to have a mild response of airstrikes against infrastructure, right? He undermines his own principled case when he doesn't understand how evil of an action this actually is. And Sam tells you that if you survive the one airstrike and get away with chemical weapons and still somehow maintain power, that's an incredibly dangerous narrative for that person who continues to exist. They cannot fiat that they will always have the ability to stop them when they are not willing to actually guarantee the regime change. That is what that analysis was about. But additionally, we would tell you that OO gives you a lot of justifications for why other types of harm are the same sort of violation of sovereignty. They're just talking about the stripping of rights of people. Yes, we think it is horrific that sarin gas dehumanizes individuals, but we don't see why dragging people from their homes and shooting them in the head does the same thing. And we think that creating this bright line standard encourages regimes not to intervene from the West because they haven't violated these international norms which they are arbitrarily defining. We think that's incredibly dangerous. We think that, in fact, death is death. And if we can show you on the opposition side that they get more death by encouraging types of warfare or allowing these types of regimes who are willing to harm their own people to exist if they maintain and are able to win power after their couple of drone strikes, that they're going to lose this debate. No thank you. I'll take closing in a little bit. First, I think, or one last thing on chemical weapons. Let's talk about these unique characteristics and how they're not in fact unique. They say that chemical weapons spread. Well, yes, some spread, but so do incendiary bombs as fires take across the people. But they use like the worst case examples, like anthrax or weaponized smallpox, which are very, very rarely used. We're often talking about nerve gases and agents, or sarin gas, which is localized in populations. But for that matter, like so are barrel bombs, and they needed to give far more work to how that actually works. Secondly, they say they're movable. This is not something unique to chemical weapons, but what they do feed into is making something like chemical weapons something of terror, something of fear, something that is so taboo that it encourages an arm race from non-state actors to go out and actually claim those. Closing if you have POI now, I'll take it.
Sure. The United States withdrew from Iraq before nation building was complete and is wary of boots on the ground style intervention. What makes you think your proposed interventions are going to be successful or long enough to actually create the change you want?
Right, what we told you is that there are certain circumstances where you need to take different actions, and having that flexibility is far more important. Iraq had a lot of mistakes in it, but when you force yourself in the usage of any weapon to intervene in that conflict, you're going to make far more dangerous circumstances, especially when you don't know the culture, right? Like you're saying we should have a full-scale invasion on Syria in a little bit if they continue to do these types of actions, and you're going to fall into the same trap. But additionally, what we think is opening opposition told you is there are circumstances where you want to intervene earlier because you think you can change it much faster, and in those circumstances where you have that certainty, creating that type of change quicker is better. Okay, second, let's move on to the state versus non-state actor portion. We think that this differentiation is uniquely important. Sam in this round gave you the differences in the incentive structures that actually exist. We disagree with opposition when they say that, oh, if you're a petrostate, you don't care about the rest of the world. That's absolutely false. If you want to be a part of the international community and trade and work with them, you have incentives. So at our worst, we agree that opening government might get some reduction in the usage of chemical weapons for these regimes. But these aren't the regimes that we're worried about, because if they're close to dying out anyways, they're just going to die out. Who are we terrified of in these circumstances? That's the non-state actors who use this as leverage to get forward in terms of these circumstances. You create an arms race where instead of going after just like suicide bombings, you try and get people to get chlorine gas into these circumstances so that you can draw the United States to go fight Boko Haram in Nigeria and further destabilize that region. You are attacking Southeast Asia when you're trying to make sure that you can intervene by violating the own sovereignty to try and get to these non-state actors. And they say, oh, well, we can make those lines where you can say we can intervene on these circumstances, but not on other circumstances. We get a stance that doesn't principally show that chemical weapons are evil over all else, when at the end of the day, if you're dead in an hour from an incendiary bomb, or dead in an hour from sarin gas, that we don't have to worry about these types of issues. On their side of the house, what they do is they pigeonhole the West into constantly fighting for some arbitrary metric and intervening in conflicts that they need not be in, fostering into the chaos and the instability that these groups are seeking for in these circumstances where we think that people using chemical weapons are most likely to engage. At the end of this debate, we're perfectly happy to concede that some government regimes are going to just switch back to traditional weapons and continue to violate human rights as they drag people into the streets and cut them down with machetes. But what they have to fight on their side of the house is that you encourage chemical weapon use on a large scale as we continue to have more and more non-state actors interact in the international stage, and encourage them to give more and more legitimacy as the government must fight them under all circumstances. That's a terrible decision for warfare in the future. Very, very proud to oppose.
Part
Thank you all so much for a
2
very excellent debate. Please shake hands. Everybody, let's give a big round of applause to the Octo-Finalists at USC.
Octo-Final round, Part 2.